In 1937, Japan was the world's fifth largest economy. By 1945, it had ceased to exist as an economic entity. Let me show you what that actually means. 80% of Japanese cities destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The currency inflated 350 times in 8 years. 350 times. A nation that produced 5 million tons of steel annually, that built the fourth largest navy on Earth, that dominated Asian manufacturing, reduced to a population of starving survivors picking through rubble. And here's what should terrify you about this story. The atomic bombs didn't cause this collapse. They ended a war, but Japan's economy had already died months earlier. This isn't a story about military defeat. This is a story about how a war bankrupted an empire before the first mushroom cloud ever appeared in the sky. Right now in 2025, we're watching potential conflicts emerge across three continents: Taiwan and China, Russia and NATO, Iran and the Middle East. And everyone's asking the wrong question. They're asking who would win militarily. They should be asking what it costs economically. Because that's the lesson Japan teaches us. You don't lose these wars on battlefields first. You lose them in your treasury, in your currency, in your industrial capacity. Japan teaches us that empires collapse from the inside out, that the economic death certificate gets written years before the military surrender. Let me show you the 6 economic stages that destroyed Japan, stage by stage, decision by decision, and why understanding them matters more today than ever before. Because the pattern doesn't care about nuclear weapons or advanced technology or how powerful you think you are. The pattern cares about what you spend, what you produce, and what happens when those two numbers stop making sense. Before we trace Japan's collapse, you need to understand where they started. Between 1920 and 1937, Japan transformed itself into an industrial colossus. They produced 5 million tons of steel annually. Their shipyards launched vessels that rivaled Britain's finest. Their textile factories dominated markets from Shanghai to Singapore. They built the fourth largest navy on Earth, modern battleships and aircraft carriers that could project power across the entire Pacific. This wasn't some backwards agrarian society. This was a fully industrialized economy that sat at the table with European powers and demanded respect. But here's the fatal flaw that would destroy everything. Japan imported 90% of its oil, 100% of its rubber, 70% of its iron ore. Think about that for a moment. Imagine building a war machine when you don't own the fuel to run it. Imagine constructing a navy when someone else controls the steel. Imagine powering an industrial economy when every critical resource flows through someone else's hands. That's not a sustainable position. That's a choke point waiting to strangle you, so they made the decision that started the clock ticking. Manchuria in 1931. They needed coal, they needed iron, so they took it. Then China in 1937. More resources, more territory, more of everything they didn't have. But wars of conquest cost money, and Japan started spending money they hadn't earned yet. By 1937, 30% of the national budget went to financing the China War. 30%. Government bonds flooded the market. The printing presses started running, and prices started rising. 30% inflation in 1937 alone. The government implemented wage controls, price fixing, anything to hide the economic strain building underneath the surface. They told citizens this was temporary war financing, just until they secured the resources they needed. They were lying. Or maybe they believed it themselves. Either way, the currency manipulation had begun, the first crack in the foundation, and Japan kept building higher. By 1941, Japan faced a mathematical problem that had no military solution. They were burning through foreign currency reserves to pay for imported oil, and those reserves were running out. Fast. The Americans, British, and Dutch had frozen Japanese assets and cut off oil exports. 88% of Japan's oil supply vanished overnight. Japan's strategic petroleum reserve held enough fuel for 18 months of normal economic activity or 6 months of war. So they chose war. Pearl Harbor wasn't a brilliant tactical strike. It was economic desperation with battleships. They needed the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and the American Pacific Fleet stood in the way. The attack bought them time to seize resources, but it also guaranteed they'd face an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity. And here's what doomed them. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced 76,000. 300,000 versus 76,000. That's not a competition. That's industrial obliteration written in advance. The entire Japanese economy reorganized around a single purpose: making weapons. Rice rations dropped to 330 grams per person per day, barely enough to survive. The government forced citizens to donate metal, anything metal. Cookware, temple bells, iron fences, all melted down for war material. 3 million workers got conscripted from civilian industries into munitions factories. In 1941, Japan produced 5,088 aircraft. In 1942, 8,861. Production increased, but so did the cost. The money had to come from somewhere, so they printed it. Currency in circulation exploded from 10 billion yen in 1941 to 30 billion yen by 1944. 30 billion. Triple the money supply in 3 years, and you can't triple the money supply without consequences. Black markets emerged in every city. Real prices ran 10 times higher than official prices. A kilogram of rice cost 1 yen in 1941. By 1944, 15 yen on the black market. Real wages collapsed. Workers saw their purchasing power drop 60%, while the government printed more yen and tightened price controls. The same rice, 15 times the cost. And they still hadn't reached the bottom. By 1944, Japan's industrial base began to implode. Not from bombs yet, that would come later. From something more fundamentals. They couldn't move resources anymore. American submarines prowled the sea lanes, hunting Japanese cargo ships with methodical efficiency. In 1944 alone, 600 Japanese ships went to the bottom. 600. By April 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had shrunk from 6 million tons to just 200,000 tons. 200,000 tons trying to supply an empire that stretched from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Here's what that meant in practice. The oil fields Japan invaded Malaya and the Dutch East Indies to capture, those fields still pumped oil. But the oil sat there. Couldn't reach Japan, couldn't fuel the factories, couldn't power the war machine. Steel mills that needed imported coal went cold. Aircraft factories that needed imported aluminum shut down production lines. Textile plants that needed imported cotton stood empty. Japan had conquered the resources they needed and then lost the ability to transport them home. The empire starved while sitting on warehouses full of supplies they couldn't access. Aircraft production, that desperate surge they'd pushed so hard to achieve, collapsed. 50% drop in the first half of 1945. Steel production fell from 5 million tons in 1940 to 800,000 tons in 1945. 800,000 tons. The empire was eating itself. Urban food rations dropped to 1,200 calories per day. That's below subsistence level. That's slow starvation written into official government policy. Workers couldn't produce weapons because they couldn't get enough food to maintain physical strength for factory work, and the money kept dying. Currency in circulation hit 55 billion yen by August 1945. Inflation reached 350% cumulative since 1937. But the numbers don't capture what happened on the ground. People stopped accepting yen, the velocity collapsed. Workers demanded payment in rice, in goods, in anything except paper money that lost value between sunrise and sunset. Banks stopped lending because the currency they'd receive back as repayment would be worthless. In Tokyo, families traded family heirlooms for bags of rice. The yen had ceased to function as money. Government bonds became decorative paper. The empire's promises, all those securities sold to finance the war, were worth exactly nothing. 2 atomic bombs ended the war in August, but Japan's economy had already died months earlier. When the war ended in August 1945, 40% of Japan's urban areas had ceased to exist. Not damaged. Ceased to exist. 25% of all buildings in the country were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. 9 million people wandered homeless through cities that looked like landscapes from another planet. But here's what the photographs don't show you. The hyperinflation didn't stop when the emperor surrendered. It accelerated. Prices increased 50 times between 1945 and 1949. 50 times. The yen that had lost all credibility during the war became even more worthless in the peace that followed. The winter of 1945 to 1946, Japanese historians call it the starvation winter. Millions of people survived on 800 calories per day. 800 calories! That's 2 bowls of rice, and that's what remained of the fifth largest economy on Earth. When MacArthur's occupation staff arrived and conducted economic assessments, they found a nation economically comparable to medieval subsistence farming. The industrial base had evaporated. The currency had died. The banking system existed only as a bureaucratic fiction. It took until 1955, 10 years after surrender, for Japan to return to 1937 economic output levels. A decade to climb back to where they'd started, before the war destroyed everything. Now let's talk about what this means today. Because the pattern Japan followed isn't historical curiosity, it's current warning. Modern militaries don't run on oil alone anymore. They run on semiconductors, on rare earth minerals, on supply chains that span continents. Taiwan produces 90% of the world's advanced microchips. 90%. If China invades Taiwan, if that production stops, what happens to the $500 billion global electronics supply chain? What happens to the weapon systems that depend on those chips? Japan went to war over oil dependency. We're contemplating war over semiconductor dependency. The resource desperation stage looks different now, but the mathematics underneath haven't changed. Here's the cost math everyone wants to ignore. Japan's military spending reached 70% of GDP before the economy collapsed. 70%. Current U.S. defense spending sits at 3.5% officially, but that number hides the real costs. Add Ukraine aid, 100 billion and counting. Add Taiwan defense commitments if China invades. Estimates range from 200 billion to 500 billion. Add NATO obligations if Russia pushes west. Add Middle East deployments if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Now add the debt service on $36 trillion in national debt. We're not at 70% yet, but we're contemplating scenarios that could push us there faster than any economist wants to calculate. Japan financed their war through bonds and currency manipulation. We're financing 3 potential simultaneous conflicts with printed dollars and treasury auctions that foreign buyers are already starting to skip. Here's what Japan teaches us that nobody wants to hear. You can't print your way out of war. You can't borrow your way out of resource dependency. You can't inflate your way out of industrial collapse. Japan in 1937 believed their empire was invincible, that their military could secure whatever resources their economy needed, that determination and sacrifice could overcome mathematical reality. 8 years later, the empire no longer existed as an economic entity. The military defeat was just the final signature on an economic death certificate written years earlier. The battleships didn't sink the economy. The debt did. The currency manipulation did. The total war spending did. The bombs just made official what had already happened. Taiwan scenario, if it happens, economists estimate $5 to $10 trillion in direct costs. That's 20% of U.S. GDP. Japan fought on one front and collapsed. We're contemplating simultaneous conflicts in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. 3 fronts. Japan's timeline from economic power to bankruptcy took 8 years. With modern financial systems, with algorithmic trading, with currency markets that move at the speed of light, it could happen faster. Much faster. Maybe modern economies are different. Maybe reserve currency status provides protection Japan never had. Maybe this time really is different. But Japan thought they were different too. Every empire does. They believed their determination mattered more than their balance sheet. They were wrong. The pattern doesn't care what you believe. It cares what you spend versus what you produce. It cares whether your currency holds value when you need it most. It cares whether your industrial base can sustain the conflicts your foreign policy commits you to. Japan's 6 stages, resource desperation, currency manipulation, total war economy, hyperinflation, industrial collapse, currency death, played out in exact sequence. Not theory, historical fact. Subscribe, because next I'll show you why the Roman Empire's collapse wasn't about barbarians at the gates. It was about something far more familiar.